All right, here's our panel for today, starting with Glenn. You're on, Glenn.
So you just want me to introduce myself?
Yeah, just give it.
Okay.
You got 2 minutes.
Okay. I'm Glenn Nishibayashi. I'm a old-time friend of Dr. Darrow here. We've known each other for a million years, over 40 now, probably approaching close to 50 now. So we went to college together. I'm 67 years old. I'm married to a career educator. She retired a few years ago, but after teaching for 38 years, she taught special education, kindergarten, second grade, and third grade. I have a bachelor's degree in psychology from UC Riverside and a master's degree in business from UCLA. I retired in 2016 after a career in financial planning and analysis, 26 years in the corporate world, and finishing my final 6 years of my career working at UCLA in their strategic planning and budgeting office. So that's my quick introduction.
Great. Aisha, why don't we go on to you?
Hi, my name is Aisha Sharves. I was actually born Erica Aisha Sharves. I go by Aisha. I've been Muslim for over 20 years. I identify as Hispanic and white. I'm fluent in Arabic. I wanted to study Arabic. It's a degree. I have a degree in community development and a minor in Arabic from Portland State University because I was a leader in the Muslim community and I'm a super liberal. And one of the ways I feel like in our community that you get a lot more traction as a leader and somebody who gets to make larger claims, perhaps about liberality in Islam, is to study Arabic, which I'm really passionate about. I received a Fulbright after I graduated to study women's leadership and social change in Abu Dhabi, the capital of the United Arab Emirates, where Dubai is. I grew up with 2 dads. When I was young, my dad came out and met my other dad here in Santa Cruz, and they've been together for like 30-something years. They're very cute together, and because of them, I'm really active in the LGBTQ plus community. I am in a cis heteronormative relationship, but I do identify as queer, and my husband is equally as supportive of my 2 dads and my family. He grew up in Egypt and has always been really cool about the LGBTQ plus community, no matter where I've lived or what friends I had. I'm really passionate about education and teachers. Thank you so much, Rob, for inviting me here. I'm really glad that you all are here and care about diversity. It's something that I see really matters to young Muslims in California, particularly. I sometimes teach Sunday school at our local mosque, and a lot of our students, appreciate it when their teachers go the extra mile to make them feel welcome in class. I also am really passionate about honesty in history as somebody who grew up going to schools where we were taught a lot of misinformation about history. It really matters to me that teachers are going a long way to make sure and include sort of the true history, for example, of something like the first Thanksgiving, So thank you very much for having me here. And I hope that whatever I have to say is useful to you all. The folks on this panel really mean a lot to me, and I've been on the panel with them for a long time. Thanks.
All right, on to Blanca. I think Blanca's on her phone, so you won't see her, but we'll hear you. So go ahead. Oh, there she is. Okay, you're on, Blanca.
I'm in my car and I'm sorry that I have to run off. I'm actually moderating a panel myself. So, but I didn't want to miss the opportunity to speak to everyone here. Like Aisha said, thank you for going into teacher education and becoming teachers. We need you. So I'm Blanca Baltasar Sabah. I am currently the Dean of Academic Counseling, Career, and Educational Support Services at Cabrillo College. This is my 2nd year there. However, my last 26 years in education were in K-12 education. I was a high school teacher, math and social studies teacher. I was a high school counselor. And then I kind of did all the jobs in between. I was an administrator at middle school, high school, district office. My last position being Associate Superintendent of Instructional Services in the Salinas Union High School District. So now I'm in higher education. I was born in Michoacan, Mexico, immigrated here when I was 3 years old to Watsonville, where my grandfather settled because he was a bracero and he really liked Watsonville. And so that's how he ended up in Watsonville. And really have been living in Watsonville ever since, except going to college. I went to Cabrillo Community College and transferred to Sac State. Came back home and got my teaching credential, my master's, my counseling credential, my admin credential, and in 2017 I got my doctorate degree. So not bad for an immigrant child of teenage parents who grew up in poverty. And my dad worked in the fields until he passed away at the age of 41. My mom worked in the canneries, and she was part of the 1985 Watsonville canning strike. So a lot of local history that I hope is being included in schools today. And that's just a little bit about me.
Do you want to talk about the immigration deportation story that you've shared in the past?
Sure. So when I was in elementary school, my dad got caught up in one of the raids that was happening in the strawberry fields in Watsonville. And so at that time, it was only myself and my brother was born here. And so we went to San Francisco. I didn't really know what was happening, but it was a deportation hearing. I didn't know what that meant, but my parents had a lawyer. Her name was Sherry. I still remember her and exactly what she looked like. And I just remember feeling very awkward because, so our lawyer didn't speak Spanish. And for some reason, I don't know why there was no interpreter, but I found myself interpreting for my parents a lot during that hearing. And then at one point they asked me to go up on the stand, and the judge, really it was a judge who asked me a lot of the questions, just where was I going to school? Who were my friends? Had I been to Mexico? Did I know my family in Mexico? What did I want to be when I grew up? What were my favorite things or my favorite subjects? And then at the end of the hearing, the judge ruled not to deport us, but actually, so my parents had been in the process of applying for residency, but it takes forever. And they were doing it through like my brother being born in the United States. So the judge said, asked the lawyer to help, this family, figure out where we were in the process, and felt that, that it was like a conditional stay. My parents didn't have any record. They were good citizens. And, I was a good student and I didn't have a life in Mexico. I was here since I was 3. And so it wasn't until a year later that I actually kind of realized what it meant to be undocumented, because as I got older and there was more raids, just being like, my parents wouldn't allow us to go out. They wouldn't let us go to school sometimes. I grew up in different places in Watsonville, but I particularly remember when I lived on Riverside, we just kind of had to hunker down at home and sometimes not go to school because my parents were afraid that this would happen again. And so living kind of like in that fear. And then finally with my parents got their residency, but in the process, the lawyer forgot to include me in the paperwork because for some reason she forgot that I was undocumented. And so then I didn't get my residency until I was a sophomore in high school through the amnesty program. And it was, I guess it wasn't until then that I really understood what that all meant. But as an adult and working in Salinas several years ago when the immigration raids were happening, and seeing our attendance rates drop because students were fearful of coming to school or parents letting them. It just brought back a lot of that trauma that I had kind of hidden or like just forgotten or didn't want to remember. And so I think it's important to kind of acknowledge like what's happening in the world and how it impacts students, even though it may not directly impact us, you know. And today I'm thinking of our students who are Jewish and Arab and Muslims with what's happening in Israel and Gaza, and just hoping like that people remain, that there's the humanitarian part of us that remembers and thinks about our students and what they or their families may be going through as this is happening around the world. Because in the United States, sometimes we tend to focus on just what's happening locally and not thinking globally. And so I think your part as teachers is super critical and important with that.
Great. So I'm going to bring in the other panelists, and we're going to do the questions first as long as Blanca can stay, and then we'll go back and hear more of the story from everybody else. So Alejandra, let's have you ask your question first, and then Maurizio will have you ask your question. But let's, Alejandra, you get to go first.
Okay, sounds good. One of the questions that everyone asked was, how can we teach history that can be hard for some students to understand, or, you know, parents don't agree with that kind of learning based on, I don't know, maybe religion or other beliefs that they have. So how do we teach that kind of history to them without being, I guess, biased in a way? I don't know.
Who's going to start the answer?
I vote for Blanca.
So how do you teach without being biased? I think it's what Aisha said, right? It's truth telling, and it's really, I will share one thing I did in my history class when I taught history for high school. And this is how I had students think about what they read and to become more critical thinkers, because I did a little skit in front of the class, and I told all the students to write down what they saw. And then after I was done with like my 5-minute skit, I had different students share what they saw me doing, and everybody had a different perspective. And so I shared with them that history books are written by certain perspectives, and in this case, like the textbook that we were using was very Eurocentric, and so we were going to have supplemental books to be able to share other perspectives. And so I think when teaching history, it's important to share that that there are different perspectives, and that we're able to share those so that our students can be critical thinkers, right? And I will share that in our middle schools and high schools, and we started integrating LGBTQ history. That was a big concern about like, what are the parents going to say? But as administrators, we have to support our teachers and share that this is history. This is something that factual that happened in our history in California and the United States. We're not trying to, give our opinion or like persuade students in any way, but this is actual history that hasn't been told, and now we're telling a fuller picture of history. But it is something that I would say, as teachers, collaborating, making sure administrators are supportive, making sure that when there are those questions that arise, that they can speak to an administrator that's going to support you, so that everybody is on the same page.
I would just add a little bit here. As a CSUMB alum, one of my best teachers, instructors, professors that I've ever had throughout my entire educational experience was at CSUMB, Dr. David Reichert. And the way that he taught our class was really focused on our ability to be able to learn from one another. And so when I think about the experience for you all in teaching some of these hard topics is more likely than not, there are people in the classroom that have been affected by things that might be challenged or questioned by the norm. And so being able to allow the students to be able to speak from their own perspectives and their own truth and share that with the rest of the class is just invaluable. We learn more from learning from all of each other than just a person in front of the classroom lecturing everybody. So I think that might be a good way of getting around it too, is just allowing people to speak their truth.
Are you sure, Glenn, anything to add?
Sure.
And in previous panels, we kind of talked about having the students talk about their own history. And then for you teachers, give a break, then you don't have to teach the class for the day, but you could have your own students teach their family history. I know teachers always like a break. I know my wife always liked any kind of break she could get. But it's also a great opportunity for children to share their family history, and an opportunity for children to do some public speaking, because I know that that's a huge thing that many adults are terrified about doing public speaking. The sooner we can get children doing public speaking, I think the better that we can do that. So having kids take the day and give their own history lesson of what's happened in their family, just as Blanca kind of shared her family history, I think that would be just such a valuable lesson for children to be able to, for your students to be able to share their family history.
I love that. I think it's nice to be able to create space that includes a lot of diverse voices, because I don't know what it's like to go to school and have somebody have a story or a narrative about someone with two dads. That was not a thing, in the late 90s and early aughts that I really saw reflected around me. I didn't see a lot of LGBTQ plus stories being told in history. Certainly, you can choose to broaden what you're talking about almost any subject to include some diversity, right? Perhaps the world's richest person in the world ever was Mansa Musa out of Africa, who was Muslim. You can include, just when you're talking about famous scientists in the world, talk about Ibn Battuta or some of the Arabs who started early astronomy. Just by choosing a wide variety of people's stories to tell, hopefully you can include more narratives than just singular ones. I think that's been one of my favorite things to see in a lot of education that my friends' kids are getting now, as opposed to my version that I got.
Great. Hey, Blanca, how much more time do you have?
Sorry, trying to navigate on my phone.
Oh.
Like 10 minutes.
Okay, great. So we got time for one more question. Maurizio, I think I'll have you ask your next question so that the panel can all respond to those. And then I know Blanca will have to leave, and then we'll go back to hear the stories of Tyler and Glenn and Aisha, and then move on to our other questions. And anybody who wants to jump in with other questions at that point, you're certainly welcome to. So Maurizio, I'll have you ask your question.
Okay, collectively as a class, we asked, have you ever received pushback from a school or community when teaching about race, privilege, and gender before?
So Blanca, you get to answer that one first.
So yeah, I'll share that when we I guess it's 2 summers ago. So we and Salinas Union High School District, we adopted ethnic studies as a graduation requirement, and that process actually went really well. However, I think it was 2 summers ago when there was the anti-CRT movement came upon. We had a lot of people show up, a lot of people, meaning like 20 people, show up to our board meeting, who later we found out were not even from Salinas. They were not even our parents. They were coming from the Monterey Peninsula. And anyway, they came to the board meeting to speak against our ethnic studies class, and in particular, some supplemental activities that we had. They really misrepresented what was in the curriculum to basically try to say that we were trying to brainwash students into certain beliefs and that we were not telling the correct history. And so it was, you know, there was this constant, and so when people go and speak at board meetings, we really cannot respond like to them because they're going during public comment. So that was a bit frustrating. But it wasn't our teachers, it wasn't our parents, it was like outside community members. But the wonderful thing that I want to share that happened was this happened during the summer. And when the students came back, they heard that this was happening, our students. So then they showed up at the next several board meetings along with these individuals. And our students spoke about why it was important to talk about race and culture and their ethnicity and what they had been learning and why it was powerful and how they were claiming their history that had not been in the textbooks. And that was just transformational. And those individuals stopped coming to our board meetings and they moved on to the next district. And so the reason I wanted to share that is that student voice is so powerful and that sometimes students can have more of an impact than adults can have. And so if there is pushback like that, like sometimes the student voice can be a powerful way to you know, help change mindsets or at least have their perspective because they're the students getting this information.
And Blanca, since I know you're going to have to leave, I'm going to move on. Could you talk a little bit about the response, because you were involved with the football game and the doll that was played around with and then became publicized, and how you dealt with that? I have that article that the students in this class will read about that, but I'm wondered if you could
Yeah.
talk a little bit about the response to how you as a district handled that.
Yeah, so the context is that there was a group of students who had a Black baby doll who somebody created an Instagram account with the different things that they were doing with the doll. Some that were just very sexist and just very very disturbing, to say the least. And so this happened at a football jamboree. And well, it happened over several days, but the culmination was at a football jamboree. So all this was on Instagram. Somebody created the account. They named the doll Shaniqua, I think. And we got wind of it on a Sunday night. And so I immediately, you know, I talked to the superintendent and cabinet, and I immediately reached out to the Monterey chapter of the NAACP because I wanted them to know, and I also wanted to know what the best approach was in this kind of a situation. We had never had this. I mean, this went viral nationwide. We were everywhere. And so what was very difficult about it is that, obviously we had to investigate, and that takes a little time because there was many students involved. And we also, as a district, cannot share student information. So we cannot share who did what to when, right? So what we did is we investigated, we gave as much information as we could to the public. However, working with the NAACP, and we also hired some partners from Oakland, peer advocates, to come and help us do some healing and restorative justice circles with our students who had been impacted. And then we also had the students who had been part of it. They had to go through a diversity, equity, and inclusion course. I believe it was like 12 hours. And then we had training also for staff and healing. But, there was things that it was very difficult because while we talked to some of our African-American Black teachers, we also didn't want to put the burden on them to, resolve this, but we did want their input. And I feel that we could have probably done more of that, and we were being just very cautious that we didn't want to like have them carry the load and the burden for something, you know, that they didn't do or cause. So we had to work a lot, and as a result of that, we partnered with CSUMB to have a DEI task force, to think about what this work is going to look like. We actually created two positions, two DEI coordinator positions, and we hired restorative justice facilitators at every one of our high schools, so to really address this. And then since then I've left, so I don't know what's been done after, but we were being very intentional about the work. And I did I put out a video to the community. I'm sure you can look it up on YouTube if you type my name, Salinas Union and Blanca. And it was a message to the community just about like taking responsibility, right? As a district, we're not perfect. And at the same time, we can't do this work alone. Racism is something that a school cannot fix, right? A district cannot fix. It's a community effort. And really, how do we engage the parents in the community with that work? And so it is very difficult, and it was a very difficult situation and very humbling. And it just, I think, really highlighted how difficult the work can be, because everybody is in a different place in the continuum of really being a co-conspirator in the work.
Great. So what the words I'm hearing are intentional, and that there was ongoing training and response and healing and education for teachers. So that's one way to respond with teachers and the parent community. So Blanca, I know you're going to have to head out. So thanks for being here. I wonder if anybody else wants to respond to anything or add on to anything that Blanca was saying. I don't know if, I know that Aisha and Tyler, you're local. I wonder if you remember that incident or have any memories of it, or how you reacted to that, or any other part of the question. In fact, Mauricio, what if you ask that question again, and then Tyler and Aisha and Glenn, if they have a response, can do so.
Oh, yeah. Have you ever received pushback from a school or community when teaching about race, privilege, and gender before?
So I'll speak to two things. One is just seeing, I wasn't involved in the process in regards to like the school board or what happened there, but just the thing that comes to mind is the incident that happened with Spreckles in the Spreckles School District regarding LGBTQ youth, and in particular. So I'll try to iterate the background as much as possible, and Rob, you might have to help me fill in some of the gaps here. But essentially, there were two teachers from the school that went to a conference, and they were panelists at the conference, and what they said was recorded and picked up by basically conservative media, and it was spun in a way to make it something more than what it really was, as if and part of what these teachers did back at the school was have a GSA type of club where they created a safe space for folks that identified as being part of the LGBTQ community. And so just seeing how not only that situation was handled in the media, but also how the school district responded by putting both of those faculty members on administrative leave, just was heartbreaking. And then they also, what is the term? They kind of paused or froze the club. They didn't allow the club to continue operating because of the fear mongerings associated with the messaging that was going out around this. And this was in our own county. This is right here in Monterey County. And so there was a lot of folks that activated in the community to try to respond to that. And there was a report that came out, and actually I'm going to post in the chat so that if folks have time later to read it. But there was an investigation that was done, and it was found that there was the claims that were essentially being made were unfounded. And fortunately, I had the opportunity to meet them, and Rob, you, I think, interacted with them probably a little bit more so, but during Pride, so I was one of the co-founders of Monterey Peninsula Pride, and every Pride year, one of the events that we have during Pride season is a Pride panel discussion, and so they were able to participate in that, and it was just a really powerful and healing experience from my perspective, to be a part of that. And so anyways, I just kind of reflect on that just to relate because I think a lot of people make assumptions that the state of California is very progressive. And although that might be true in comparison to other places, that doesn't mean that there's not still issues that we're dealing with here. And when we talk about LGBTQ plus rights, oftentimes people make this assumption that didn't they get what they needed by, being able to marry who they want at a federal level? And there's so much more to being LGBTQ than just being able to marry who you want. There's the right to fair and equitable housing. There's, the right to healthcare. I mean, there's all these issues that exist in regards to that identity. And so I just share that example as something that's local and relevant. And then I'll pause before I share my second thing to pass it to Rob, because I don't know if you wanted to add anything to that situation.
No, go. I would just say, go ahead and why don't you share your other thought? And then why don't you, let's back up to your bio, and why don't you share your story? And then we can go from you to Glenn, Daisha, to hear those parts of your stories, and then we'll see what other questions come up.
And then the other thing I would share is, and this I will get to a little bit more in my bio, but I am the mayor of Monterey. And so we had a council meeting on September 19th, less than a month ago, where white supremacist groups formed together. There was 3 of them, and I can only remember the 2 names right now. One was Make America White Again, and the other one was Proud Boys. And so they called into our meeting, a group of them, and they were spewing racist and anti-Semitic comments just nonstop. And I mean, the worst that I've ever heard it. Like I knew that it existed. I'm not terribly surprised that people think that way, but it changes the situation when you're actually hearing it. And there's so many different elements to this, but to describe the background of what happened. So they would call in, and one after another they would go. And the thing you have to know is in a public setting, First Amendment rights trump hate speech. So we cannot stop somebody from saying hate speech in a public setting. It is their First Amendment right. And so for the first few speakers, I'm looking at the city attorney and I'm looking at the city manager, and I'm trying to figure out how to best navigate this, because this is harmful. This is creating harm in our community. People are having to hear this and endure this. And I'll describe more later about how exactly that affected people. And so finally we figured out, well, if they're not on topic, I can give them a warning. And then if they don't get back on topic, then I can we can remove them. And so eventually I was able to get through them. And one of the other problems was that they would hang up and they would call back under a different name. And so they wouldn't let public comment end. And fortunately, we caught on and we noticed that some of the voices were the same. So we just cut them off right away. And eventually we were able to get it to stop. But then we had to go back into public comment later. And we ended up just having to cancel the meeting. So on the tail end of this, I went by City Hall the next day to do something unrelated to this. And I ran into one of the staffers that was at the meeting, and she had just unloaded to me about how she felt about what happened and how it was just the conversation that was happening among city staff. And clearly the staff were affected. So I spent the rest of the morning going around to all the offices, just checking in with staff to make sure that everybody was okay. But there's so much more to it than that, right? It's an ongoing thing. It's not just like a one and done. And then it's also all the people in the community that also heard it that I was hearing from in regards to how they were affected by it. So, you know, it's just so harmful to be able to have to go through these things. The whole reason why, I wouldn't say the whole reason why this happened. Part of the reason why this happened is during the pandemic, we started allowing people to participate in public meetings via Zoom. Before, you had to come into the council chambers to participate in a public meeting. But there's a social equity piece to allowing people to participate in public meetings from their home, you know, working multiple jobs, taking care of their family, whatever it is, disabled, you know, whatever it might be. It allows more people to participate. And so we struggled because there was a big push to try to not allow public comment anymore via Zoom, just so that we didn't have to allow the public to endure listening to that hate speech anymore. And so we found a middle ground that we're trying out, and hopefully it works. Fortunately, we've gone through it once, so I'm able to cut people off sooner too if we notice it happening. But we've now added layers to how to participate in public comments, which it's like we have staff reading this whole paragraph. It extends the meeting longer, but it's hopefully going to allow the process to be a little bit more efficient in regards to how public participates. So I just shared that as another like recent and relevant thing. I mean, as a Black mayor, and hearing the things that they said about Black people was
Wow.
it was shocking. And as much as my own feelings, which I, you know, are real, and I can share that in this type of setting, I don't focus on me in the moment that it's happening, right? Because I'm focused on the residents, the staff, you know, the public at large, my colleagues, and it's a lot. And we're trying to create a space where we welcome everybody, but how do we do that when people probably will decide not to participate because of the fear of having to endure hate speech? So it's a really interesting space to navigate. And I could go on, and I could probably do a whole lecture on this topic. And in fact, I will be speaking, I think, I'm not sure if it's this weekend or next weekend, the ACLU, the local chapter is going to be having an event where I'm going to be on a panel discussing some of this a little bit further and some solutions about how we move forward as a society. But anyways, just sharing those.
Wow.
stories.
So I want to just say that was just last month, right? A month
That's
ago.
correct.
Wow.
That's correct.
Boy. Okay. Well, do you want to share your regular bio, or you want to somebody else to share and then come
Sorry, I'm
back to
sorry. I
you?
was such a Debbie Downer.
Oh no, my
on a
gosh. It's
positive
just
note.
like, oh my gosh. It just blows my mind that those things are happening like that. Yeah.
Well, and one of the things that I will share in this space is we see this happening in Congress. Even you look at some of the statistical changes that are occurring within representation, right? And what we generally see happening over the last several decades is centrists are disappearing and extremists are growing, right? And so it's extremism on both sides. I think the two-party system is part of the problem because it pits us against each other. You're either this or that. And so you almost have to have this more extreme view to be electable. And what that's doing is it's causing society to make ourselves look like we're further apart than we really are. And the big thing that I worry about with this whole thing happening is our inability to be able to listen to each other and appreciate somebody that comes from a different perspective and just be respectful. I mean, it's so important just for us to be able to socialize, get off of social media, stop reading the headlines of news articles. And then, of course, the pandemic didn't help with folks in younger generations. So we have to be able to find a way of being able to socialize with each other and just being able to understand people, particularly folks that are different than us. So anyways, that part being done, my name is Tyler Williamson. and just sharing a little bit about myself. My parents, I'm from a biracial relationship. My mom is mixed white and my dad is Black. My dad was born and raised in Mississippi in the 40s. And when he was 12, his family migrated up to Albany, New York. And the reason why that happened was because his oldest brother would talk back to white people, and his parents were my grandparents were in fear that he was going to get himself killed. So they had neighbors that had family that lived in Albany, and they made an arrangement to allow him to go live with them. He moved up to Albany, got a job, saved up enough money to purchase a car, drive back down to Mississippi, and drive his entire family back up to Albany. So that's when my dad migrated up to Albany. And then my mom is from a town 45 minutes north of Albany, New York, called Glens Falls, like red country, New York. It's kind of like, if you can imagine California, like, the Central Valley, kind of inland California is red and the coast is blue. It's very much like that in New York State as well. And so I guess I have to be kind of careful because I might be expressing my political beliefs here a little bit, but my mom has a sister that has a Trump mug, and she like waves it proudly, which is just kind of very offensive to me in so many ways. But that's kind of my parents' background. So my mom joined the Navy, and I was born at her first duty station in Patuxent River, Maryland. And I've never lived anywhere for more than 4 years my entire life, until I moved to Monterey in 2010, because I got a job at the Naval Postgraduate School. So I came here in 2010, and I'll back up for a second. I have 3 brothers. My mom had us really engaged in the community. So I always was involved in the community my entire life, whether it was volunteering at soup kitchens, feeding the homeless, picking up trash on Earth Day. I was in Boy Scouts. I became an Eagle Scout. I mean, I was super engaged and involved. I'm like that overachiever guy that you probably all kind of hate. So that was me. And so it wasn't any different when I moved here. And then if I were to back up one more time, right before I moved to Monterey, I was living in San Diego. I was going to community college down there, and I was taking a class. And the subject at the time wasn't super interesting to me, but sometimes it's just the teacher that you have and the way that they teach it that really draws you in. And so it was a critical thinking class, and she was teaching us civil disobedience and, just social justice in a big kind of net casting way of saying it. And just the way that she taught it again was like really moving for me. And at the same time, so this was in 2008, and at the same time, somebody that looked like me was running for president of the United States. And I was never paying attention to current events at that point in my life. But like, I started getting more drawn in, like the way that Obama spoke and the messages that he was saying really drew me in. And that's when I really started getting involved in politics. Up until that point, I was going to school to go to medical school. So I switched my major to poli-sci. I signed up for an internship with my congressman. I volunteered on the Obama campaign, but I didn't get as involved as I wanted to in 2008 because I was going to school, working 2 jobs. So I committed to myself that when the 2012 campaign came around, I would get more involved. So by that time, I was living up here. I signed up for his fellowship program for his campaign. I got accepted into that, and they tasked me with coming back to Monterey and creating the first neighborhood team in the entire county. So I did that. The team grew really quickly, and after 3 weeks, they offered me a position on the campaign. And so I accepted that, worked for the Obama campaign. I was responsible for the Obama campaign out of the San Francisco headquarters. Interestingly enough, up until that point in my life, I was closeted. And so it was because they had, in a large way, they had put the office in the smack dab middle of the Castro. And so it was like ceiling to floor windows, and like there's these beautiful men walking by all day. And I had some volunteers that, it's San Francisco, like that are super accepting of people, who people are. So they kind of helped me come out to myself. And then I met my first male partner there. Obviously, it led to the successful re-election of President Obama. And afterwards, I had to come back, and there was a whole experience of coming out to my family, which is a story for another day. But one of the central points of the Obama campaign is community organizing. So I brought those community organizing skills from the Obama campaign back down to Monterey. And that's how I helped find Monterey Peninsula Pride. I used those skills to help me find and start Monterey Peninsula Pride in 2017. And then just my involvement in the community, whether it was through the local Democratic Party or through Pride stuff or whatever it was in the community, I just started having conversations with folks about the idea of running. And really what got me to run was because before this point, I wasn't really paying attention to local politics. I was paying more attention to this national stuff, right? Obama, president, it was like, it's like the more shiny thing. It's what media talks about. But what's really, really important is local politics. All politics is local is the phrase, because you have more of a direct impact. Your voice means a lot more. And when I was looking at the elected officials that existed at the local level, particularly at the city council level, I heard them speaking about the things that I value, but when it came time to actually doing the policy work to support those values, nothing was being done. So that's really what motivated me to run, was to like get the work done. And I will share that. So there's 5 council members, there's a mayor, and we're actually currently in the process of transitioning into district-based elections. So this last election, 2 of the council seats transitioned to that, and then the election next year, the other 2 council seats will transition to that. The mayor seat stays at large. So in 2018, when I decided to run for council, there was 2 council seats up, at large council seats. I was running against both of the incumbents, the people that were currently serving in that position. They were running for re-election. On election night, when the first set of results came out, I was the top vote getter, like by far. And then the 2 incumbents, they were like neck and neck. So they called the race for me, but they didn't know who was going to fill that second council seat. So I share that because I think it speaks to, in a lot of ways, the power of like a people-driven campaign. I knocked on so many doors. I knocked on every door in my neighborhood myself. And then I had a team of folks that were helping me knock on doors in the rest of the city. And it really just made a huge difference. Just going out and having conversations with folks and understanding what the issues that were most important to them. And you all probably wouldn't be surprised to hear that the #1 issue that we heard over and over again was housing inaffordability. So shocker. So anyways, that election happened, and I'm going to fast forward, and I'll speak to some of the issues in a second, but I'll fast forward to when I ran for mayor. So when my term was coming to an end, it was a 4-year term. So when it was coming to an end last year, I had to decide whether I was going to run for re-election again, whether I was going to run at all. And I was having some conversations with some residents. The idea of me running came up, and it was like, well, it actually seems to be the perfect solution for me, because if I ran for re-election, the council would have stayed exactly the same. And I was a 4 in the minority on a lot of really tough issues that I was trying to push forward. So I wasn't really willing to put myself through another 4 years in the council with the same group of guys, by the way, all straight old white men. And so it's just a different perspective. I wasn't willing to put myself through that. So I felt, let me run for mayor. If I don't win, no harm, no foul. I can go on and do great things somewhere else. But if I do win, I can change the makeup of the council in a way to where I can gain a majority. And that's exactly what happened. I won mayor. By the way, the guy that ran against me was not only endorsed by the previous mayor, but his father was this longest serving mayor in Monterey, Dan Albert Sr. They named the Monterey High School football field after his father. They have the same exact name. So I was running against legacy, and I won. And so he was my colleague on the council too. And there's a rule in the city of Monterey that if you run for mayor, even if you're in a safe seat, you lose your council seat. So he ran against me and he lost his seat, even though he was in a safe seat. And so I got to help fill that vacancy by appointing somebody. I got somebody to run with me to fill my seat that I was vacating on the council. And there was a guy that kind of supported me on the council before, but he would like hit what part of his complex is to vote with the majority. And so now that I have the majority, he tends to vote with me now. So now I've completely flipped the council and it's a 4-1 majority in my favor, which is just freaking amazing. And quickly, because I know I'm getting a little bit long-winded here, I just want to focus on some of the issues I'll speak to. Housing affordability, and I put it into 2 buckets. One is it's a supply and demand issue. So on the supply side, we need to create more housing stock. It's probably the biggest reason why the cost of housing continues to skyrocket. So think about it like this. You have whatever X number of units that exist in a city. People have kids. people move into the town, the population grows, but you're not creating more housing. So what happens is the wealthiest people in the community will continue to outbid each other, pushing the cost of housing up. And the poorest people in the town will get pushed out. And that's how you end up with homelessness, right? So it's a supply and demand issue. We need to create more housing stock. But there's, if you heard the term NIMBYism, not in my backyard, every community, everywhere, there's NIMBYs. People do not want more housing development. We all need to do our part. So I'm a big advocate of Monterey doing its part, so much so that the majority of the jobs on the Monterey Peninsula are in the city of Monterey because of the hospitality industry, because of the healthcare industry, because of the education industry. Those are the three biggest industries on the peninsula, and the city doubles during the day because of the number of people that come in from the workforce. So we need to create more housing for our workforce to help stabilize the cost of housing. And on demand side, 66% of our residents are renters, which is the exact opposite of the national average. The national average US city has 60% homeowners and 40% renters. That's because the high cost of housing, but there's no protections beyond what the state offers, which is lackluster at best, to protect the renter population. So we're really trying to focus on policies that create more protections for renters. And right now, actually at our council meeting next week, I'm almost certain we're going to be passing a rental registry, which is going to require landlords to register their property so that we can start collecting data and really get a true assessment of what's going on in the city so that we can come up with the right suite of policies to create additional protections for the renter community. So housing is a really big issue. Water is a really big issue in our community because we can't create housing without water. And then the last thing I will speak to is community engagement. Beyond issues, individual issues, community engagement is the most important thing because we don't have to agree with each other. But if we can't have a space where we can all come together and have that conversation, it's going to be more or less the same thing that we have, which is people getting into positions of power and keeping things exactly as they are because they have people that are funding their campaigns that are completely happy with keeping the status quo the way that it is. We need to make sure that we can shake things up, change enough, and be adaptable to society based off of the needs that exist within our communities. And that only happens by having a robust community engagement process. By the way, we live in a democracy, which requires people to be engaged in the process. We only live in a democracy on paper. We actually have to practice democracy, and that requires us removing the barriers that exist that prevent people from wanting to participate in the political process in the first place. So I'm going to stop there.
Great. So for all of you listening out there, it gets back to who's a citizen, who thinks they're a citizen, and what you all do in the classroom to let them know they're all part of this democratic process. So that's what Tyler's saying. Let's move on to Glenn. And Glenn, why don't you share a little bit about your cultural background and some of your stories that you normally share?
Thanks, Rob. So years ago, when I first formed this panel, it kind of talked about us addressing the question of how is your history represented in your education. And I have to say that my family history was probably not represented at all in any of education. I understand that since then, some of it has started to get into the curriculum, but let me share a little bit about my family history. I'm a generation American Japanese descent. So in the Japanese world, that's the Sanseis. My parents, my paternal and maternal grandparents were born in Japan, and that would make them the first generation, so the Issei, and they are the ones who emigrated from Japan. My parents, the Nisei, were born in Los Angeles. Both parents were born in Los Angeles. But during World War II, as a result of the Presidential Executive Order 9066 that FDR implemented, my parents and grandparents were forced to leave the Los Angeles area. This was all during World War II. They were sent to prison camps, which since then we've euphemistically called them internment camps or relocation centers. They were actually technically concentration camps for those of Japanese ancestry. So they were sent to these camps just based on ancestry and what they looked like. My father's family was sent to Jerome, Arkansas from Los Angeles. My mother's family was sent to Heart Mountain, Wyoming from the Los Angeles area. All of their siblings, my parents and all of their siblings were all U.S. citizens by birth. My father was 19 at the time and my mother was 17 at the time. So history tells us that there were 120,000 people of Japanese ancestry that were sent to these concentration camps, of which over 60% of them were U.S. citizens. My grandparents were not U.S. citizens, but because they were restricted by law from becoming citizens or actually owning any property, they later became natural citizens. My mother graduated from high school while at Heart Mountain, and she was the valedictorian of her high school class. My father served in the U.S. Army during World War II at the very same time that his family was in the internment camp in Jerome, Arkansas. He was an officer. My father was an officer in the military intelligence service, served under General MacArthur. And in the post-war era, he served in Tokyo, translating the post-World War II war trials. So in the past, I've shared a little bit of my experience of visiting one of the camps, the camp where my mother's family was interned during World War II. A few years ago, on a across the country with my young son, we visited the site of Heart Mountain, where my mother's family was sent to live behind barbed wires with armed guarding 24-hour day. Right now, if you're ever there, it's in the middle of nowhere, as most of these camps were. If you're ever there, there's a very nice visitor center there. I encourage you to go there and read a little bit about that. But as I entered the visitor center, the docent there, as they would do with most people coming in who kind of like Japanese, asked if any of the family members were at Heart Mountain. And I said, indeed, yes, my mother and her family, my parents, my uncle, aunt were all there at Heart Mountain. So while I was touring around the center, I was carefully looking at all the pictures, looking really closely, trying to see if I could see if my mother was in any of the pictures. And I walked around the corner and there's a picture there that was about 3 foot by 5 foot with a picture of the Heart Mountain Photography Club. And kneeling right in the center of the picture, Rob has a picture there. That's me standing there with my golf hat on. The guy with the hat on right in the middle is my grandfather. And in the background, that's my grandfather. Rob's really prepared here. So that's my grandfather. So as I was visiting with my son, my young son was with us, and so I told him, son, this is why you have big ears. Take a look at your grandfather's ears. You can see this is why you inherited big ears from your grandfather. It's not just my fault. But anyways, I saw that picture and I literally gasped. I go, oh my gosh, that's my grandfather. And there's a woman standing next to me, and she asked me, she goes, did you know your grandfather? I go, absolutely, I knew my grandfather. He used to come over to our house all the time. So it really made me realize that people think of this history so long ago, but it really wasn't that long ago. That as a child, I definitely knew my grandfather, and my grandfather, my grandmother, my mother, my uncle, my aunt were all there in Heart Mountain, Wyoming during World War II. They spent a couple of years there. So imagine, if you will, being a 17-year-old in high school about ready to become a senior, and all of a sudden you're told you're given a couple days to pack only what you can carry, and then you're moving to Wyoming. So California, I remember my mom telling me a story that it's really cold in Wyoming in the winter, and that they didn't have the right clothes when they were there. So they had to order a lot of stuff through the Sears catalog to get clothes. So while we were touring the visitor center, the docent pulled the government records of my mother's family, showed when they arrived, specific unit or multifamily barrack that they lived in, their government assigned numbers while they were in the internment camps. They departed camps and where they actually went when they departed. The government kept all these records, and those are all part of the public record now. She also gave me a current picture, an aerial picture of the areas that currently stands with an overlay of where all the barracks were. So we decided that we would go out and walk this dirt path and stand on the site about where my mother's family's bed would have been. And I'll tell you, it was a pretty moving experience to stand there and imagine what it would have been like to be a 17-year-old girl being completely taken from your home, taken from your school, and put in multifamily barracks and having to live and go the rest of your high school years behind barbed wire. So it was a tremendously moving experience for me because they were, just to think how they were treated as criminals simply because of what they look like and what their ancestry was. So I know that when I was in school, none of these things were ever mentioned in any American history class that I ever took. And I go to high school after World War II, so it could have easily been included in the history books. But so my family's history really was not included in any history class that I ever took. So I think it's really important for each child's history to be represented in class, because and I know, having been married to a career educator, that classroom is really important. So I know that the time is valuable in your daily classroom. So in my classroom, when I was in school, my family history wasn't represented. So I guess it was important enough. So looking at that, I can't help but think, well, if my family history is not that important, then maybe I'm not that important. I think it's so important for everyone's history to be represented, so that they know that it's valuable classroom time. But if you're giving your students time to present their history, to share their history, then you're showing each of your individual students that the history is important. So, anything else I forgot, Rob?
No, I think that's good. For the class, if you remember, in our last class, when we talked about our me posters, and I shared that one book from Mrs. Nishibayashi. This is Mrs. Nishibayashi's husband. So in Kathy's class, she would do a me writing of every student in the class, and then they would write about each student and put a book together for each kid. So that's one way to do that work that you're talking about. So great. So that's that part. So Aisha, why don't you share a little bit about your cultural journey, and then after you're finished, we'll hear some questions from Lupita.
I mean, I think I shared a lot. I got a chance to stuff it all in at the beginning quite a bit. I don't have a whole lot extra to add. I'd love to get on to questions. As I mentioned,
Okay.
I just grew up with two dads. That's my favorite fun, diverse fact about me. My family is white and Hispanic. I do get the joy of getting asked where I'm from and where my family's from and where my grandparents are from quite a lot for being a white girl. I will tell you that. But they're from Idaho. That's what I usually tell them. That's the only time I'm really proud to have had, like, my mother lives in Idaho, almost Canada. And that's the only time I'm ever super proud of that. Usually I'm from California, which is true. But that's the time I'm really proud of my Idaho roots.
So you
I
get
think
you said the joy of people asking you that question, where are you from, huh? You say it like that.
And
you don't ever get tired of people asking you that question?
I do. I always am like, sometimes I'll just say, like, I'm from here, and they're like, no. I mean, and I don't mind if you just say, like, where are you from, and I say from here, and you go cool, then I'm actually not tired of that, and I don't mind that question. Then when you go, like, where are your parents from, no, and I'm like, also from here.
No, but
like,
from
like, it's a question if you ask it with the right inflection. Wrong, but I'm not. I'm just from here. Sometimes I'll be like, I converted to Islam, because that's like what they're actually asking. or will just, my other favorite thing is to always turn it around on people. When they get to my grandparents, I'm like, my grandparents were from here too. My grandpa, like one of my grandparents moved here from Scotland, and one of them moved here from some islands owned by Portugal and Spain. Where is your grandparents from? And then they're usually like, I have to go. You want a receipt with your purchase? It's usually about it.
I'm going to remember that, Aisha, because I've been asked that "where are you from" question throughout my life.
bet.
That's a good answer. Great. There's a video that's out there with a woman, an Asian woman, who's being asked where she's from, and I actually know, the through the church, my church priest. That's sister-in-law that made that video. It's a riot.
Is it the
funny.
runner?
It's funny, and it's
the track runner.
Yes, it's the runner.
I love her.
Yeah, she's running along a trail. She's running along a trail, and she's done a number of videos like that. But anyhow, I do have a connection to that person indirectly. But having asked that question so many times throughout my life, I appreciate now I have a better answer.
Please use it whenever you like. My super
Thank you.
obnoxious feminist mean girl answer is not a mean girl answer, but my super obnoxious overly feminist answer, and because I like saying words sometimes people are offended by, only if the person has ultimately offended me really, really badly or been weird or something, then I say my mom's vagina. But just to say the word vagina, dirty word. It's just a part of the body, like hands and feet and hearts and lungs. But only once, like only if they're real mean, Glenn, because that's still true. And if you say uterus, that's apparently better received than vagina.
Rob, you are recording this.
It's all being recorded.
I
Yeah,
don't feel bad.
this is new information. We've never shared this before. So
It's a health
for
word,
this class,
people. I'm sorry.
we've got some new information that this group's never shared before. But it's interesting
just
how you
super
all
feisty.
reacted to that question. That's great.
This panel
should
is getting
definitely
way
do
too
the
familiar. We're getting way too familiar with each other.
I'm like this all the time. Sorry. I'm on my best behavior sometimes.
Should we see what the
Could you
question is
imagine
from?
if we went to like public events together, Aisha? Like we probably wouldn't be able to be next to each other. It would just be like a riot.
Oh no, that's all I want now for my future.
All in the best ways though. That's all I want to.
All right,
Rob, we clearly need to get back together.
Yeah, let's move on to Lupita's question. And then if other students in this class have questions, you can just jump in or type them in the chat. So Lupita, you're on.
Hi, thank you so much for joining us today in our class. We're really excited to become educators, and one of the hardest things that we are learning about is teaching history. And as a class, we have asked what would be the best way to teach history or difficult topics in a classroom setting for students who might seem to struggle to accept certain historical events or beliefs.
Only Blanca was here. She always has great answers for these. She's such an awesome educator. I like don't even envy how hard that must be. I'm not really sure how people get to deny history or like that the world is round. But they do, and I think that must be hard. I've seen it. I've seen a lot of really great approaches to things like LGBTQ plus history from certain groups here in the state. So, you know, not reinventing the wheel, find out how other teachers are doing it and what perhaps, you know, if you're talking about the real history of Christopher Columbus not finding America, then, you know, I think that there's people who resist that. So doing your best to find the sources and use curriculum that's approved so that you know that what you're teaching is factual and historical has often been Blanca's advice.
So my partner was a high school history teacher up until this last school year. He recently became an administrator, but history teacher his entire career. and oftentimes see him integrating the requirement for students to identify primary and secondary sources within their research. And so, like, if there was, I would imagine if I had a student that questioned me about it, I would say, well, go find me your primary and secondary sources. And then we could have a conversation around why there might be questions of reliability in regards to some of those primary sources that I imagine that they would probably be relying on to come to their conclusions. And then how can we reorient to reliable primary sources in order to get to the truth of where the facts really lie in regards to history.
So I'll just remind everybody that one of those entry points is literature, and picture books work well for every grade level. When I was a school library media teacher at the middle school level, I increased the number of picture books at that level because there were students who were reading at that level, but secondly, because teachers could introduce different concepts, especially different cultures, through picture books. So I would remind all of you about the literature piece. And the second part, I just heard this last week. Somebody talked about they had an event where students or the participants brought in an archive. So since whoever just talked about primary and secondary sources, it made me think about what are the documents or artifacts of your family or your history, right? So bringing in artifacts related to a history or a culture is another way to do that. And of course, your students could do that. So I'll just throw that out for the good of the order here.
Well, Robin, I would just add to the literature piece, and this might be kind of where you were going with it, but just kind of where my mind went when you said that is, how do we introduce like literature or whatever, picture books or, stories for whichever grade level, that tell the story of the other, right? And not be kind of always the traditional stories that are shared in the educational setting. So it's just really important to make sure that there's a diverse collection that's shared with the students. Oh, and a great place to start might be where a lot of these states are doing the book banning. I actually was thinking I want to start a book banning reading club. Like a book club. I would love to do that. So I'm trying to think about how I can do a collaboration with MPUSD to get that going with some students.
In your spare time. Great.
In my spare time. But I love reading though. So
let's see.
I think that's such a good point. Like, it's through reading that I found out what the real history that I wasn't even taught, right? When somebody finally had pity on poor young and inexperienced uneducated me and was like, well, maybe you'd like to read Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States to find out why Columbus is a dirtbag. Personal opinions, and maybe history. So I think that reading really did change that for me, right? And people offering me books or teachers who had enough diverse books on hand and subjects that we could choose to write about made a huge difference in my education and finally bringing me out of this extreme misinformation that I was fed, like that missions were great or happy. What?
Lupita, Alejandra, or Maurizio, were there any other questions that haven't been brought forward? Or anybody else have any other questions you want to ask?
There is a question that I'm seeing right here on our list from our class. There is a topic we talked about that you guys had talked about earlier about racism and teaching in very conservative places. What is your advice, or it says What advice do you have for someone who will work in a conservative area? This could be an area that has a history of parents going to school boards, but wants to incorporate these topics into the curriculum. How would you best approach maybe something like that in that situation?
I mean, I do think that sometimes you can go a long way if you can't even teach something to show that you're open and affirming for LGBTQ plus kids. Like you can hopefully have a rainbow heart pin. You know, my favorite denim jacket that I wear everywhere has like a rainbow heart pin and a little pin that says no hate, and on my water bottle and on my cups. If you can at least like put up something that shows that you're a safe person to talk to, hopefully you can go a long ways. And I think that's why Blanca and Glenn and a lot of folks suggest students telling their stories. But I guess the challenge in that can be like, what if you don't have a really diverse group of students? And I don't really have a good answer for that. I just know that it makes a huge difference to some people to see even some small part of their identity represented in a way that they know that this teacher or person in a place of power would like support them or care about their needs if you can't teach about it.
So I just would remind everybody, and maybe Glenn wants to talk about this, is so you heard Glenn's story. So many of you work in all Latinx schools. And imagine if in that Latinx history class, you only talk about Latinx history and you never talk about Japanese American history or African American history, then you're leaving out, or Muslim American history, then you're leaving out these three people who are talking to you. So I would just point out that including people's history is just, well, first of all, it's what we require people that teach history in our state. But from another perspective, it's everybody's history. Everybody's history is everybody's history in our state. So I don't know if Glenn or Tyler want to add on to that.
I read another panel that you were doing with LGBTQ students, and simply the importance of pronouns for them. On my Zoom, I actually put, I've never thought about putting him on my Zoom identifier thing, but after watching that panel and the importance of recognizing the differences and how people want to be, what to be called, how they want to be treated, I think it's very, very important. And I'd say, look, if you need to talk a little bit about Chinese American history, let me know. I'll come to your classroom. I'm retired. I've got time to go do that kind of thing. So really, look at people in your community to see, what resources you have out there, because there are lots of us retirees who'd be happy to come in and talk to some kids. My wife encourages me to do that all the time. My wife continues, even though she's been retired for a number of years, she continues to go in and volunteer in the class to help out some of her friends that are still teaching. So don't forget about the retired community. There are lots of people out there looking for important things to do, and I couldn't think of anything more important to do than to share some of the history of the United States that I would say, in some areas, me telling that story would be banned, right? Because that's critical race theory. Telling the experience of World War II in incarcerees is not a pretty thing for the United States, but it's important for us to know so that we don't do it again, right? The old adage of if you don't know history, you're doomed to repeat it. I know that after 9/11, it was the Japanese American community that really came and stood beside the Muslim community when it started talking about rounding up all the Muslims. It was the Japanese American community that says, United States, we've done this before. We're not going to do it again. And we're going to stand beside our Muslim brothers and sisters to make sure that this doesn't happen to U.S. citizens again. So
I would just add one more thing to this, which is just more of a reiteration of what Blanca had shared earlier. But I think getting folks to show up to school district board meetings that are in support, that are allies for sharing the history of diverse group of folks is absolutely critically important. It makes a difference. It really does, because you will absolutely have people on school district boards that will be swayed because of the people that show up in a space. And so if you can counteract that with, it doesn't have to even be the equal number of voices, but if you can get that or even more, it can just make the world of a difference. And how you do that is you find allies in the community, you find groups to help organize and do that work, right? So NAACP, ACLU, the local pride organization, you reach out to these groups and you just get them to stand with you and support you and showing up to the board meetings to help counteract that negative narrative.
Yeah, parents will show up for that. Right now, there's a lot of church stuff in the news, and I see on a lot of my like the mosque chat and my friends chats with, I'm a part of a group called Muslims for Progressive Values that I absolutely love. They're really LGBTQ plus affirming. I see a lot of people giving advice to right school boards and teachers, asking them to present things in the news in a way that's really inclusive and doesn't exclude anyone from feeling like they're being supported, from caring about rises in anti-Semitism and Islamophobia. Like, you as a teacher also can set that tone that is inclusive of those people by just reaching out to those groups and saying, like, hey, if you care about this, do you want to pass this around to your members who have kids in X school district? Because we're having trouble with critical race theory, and I just want to teach about Reconstruction after the Civil War. You know, and seeing if, and usually giving them like a letter, a pre-written, like, if you would like to write this to your school board or something.
I think something Blanca mentioned before she left was in that incident where the students came and spoke before the board. The power of the voice of students is really, really powerful. I had my son, when he was like 10 years old, speak before the city council about an issue he cared about. And it was amazing, his ability to articulate what he wanted and what the board was considering doing that he disagreed with. And the power of students is amazing. So, I would say, as much as you can, invite your students. I know some of you are going to be elementary school teachers, so it's kind of hard, but it's still amazing what a 6 to 12-year-old or 13-year-old could say to convince adults, because as the saying goes, out of the mouths of babes comes a lot of truth. So I encourage you, if they believe in something, to speak up.
And how that pulls on the emotional heartstrings of adults. I mean, it's just like so freaking cute to see a kid get up there and speak. So yeah, absolutely.
So along those lines, just to parse to answer, so here's how the question was answered: is, first of all, if the stories come from students or the stories come from their parents who you allow to be guests in your classroom, then you're just sharing people's stories that way, right? It's not that you're supporting one person or the other. You're sharing people's stories, much like I did tonight, bringing in these guests to speak to all of you. I didn't tell them what to say or how to say it. It's their voices. So remember that structure is something you can do in your classroom at any time, inviting people in. The other thing I would say is, but you don't want to do it just one time, right? You don't want to just have a discussion about people's cultures one time and then drop it, right? You want to build it in, as Glenn's wife, Kathy Nishibashi, did in her class, where that me poster and writing about each other's culture happened all year long, so that every student in that class got stories written about them and their stories. So part of it is just not to do it a one-off or as a reaction to something, but that it's ongoing, so that, we broaden our understanding of each other's culture, which is what social justice is all about. So I'm going to give Aisha, Tyler, and Glenn about a minute each to give your final words of wisdom to the group, and then we'll close out for the evening. So Glenn, we'll go you, and then Aisha, and then Tyler gets the final word.
But I just want to thank all of you for being interested in the profession of educating our young people. It's important. I mentioned earlier, I'm married to a career educator, and I believe 100% in the importance of the future is based on what our children are learning. I appreciate what you're doing. And as I mentioned before, don't forget about retirees, and because we'd love to help out wherever we can. I'm a whole group of golf buddies. We won't skip golf, but we'll come and speak in your classroom on days we're not playing.
Thank you so much for your time, and for my friends on the panel. Always good to see you, Rob. Thank you for asking me to be here. If you're gonna give your time and energy towards being a teacher, I know that it means a lot to students. It means a lot to all the care that you take to think about and notice if your child, if one of the children in your class is experiencing homelessness, if you see somebody who's experiencing bullying. There's more than half of Muslim students in California report receiving bullying at school, sometimes from administrators and teachers, but usually from their peers. And that is true, I'm sure, for other ethnicities, other religions. Certainly right now, a lot of my Jewish friends are very worried about anti-Semitic acts and words. And it sounds like, according to Tyler's most recent city hall town meeting, there's still a lot of that going around that makes students feel really marginalized. So thank you for being the answer to those things and bringing real history, please, back to schools, and not carrying on a lot of the misinformation that we were taught for a long time, like the fake story of the first Thanksgiving or Christopher Columbus didn't find mainland America. So thank you so much for carrying forward and for really being a part of the change and helping to raise new generations of young people. Teachers really make a big difference, especially when people don't have enough support at home.
I just echo all of that. I so much appreciate the profession that you all are in or going into. And it's so undervalued in this country. I will continue to support efforts to pay teachers more, because where we prioritize how much certain professions get paid it just shows where our values are. And so there's so much further that we need to go to support teachers. I am a partner of somebody that has had a career in teaching, and just seeing the impact that that's had on him over the years, it's just hard to see. And he's doing it because he cares and loves these kids. And I imagine it's very much the same for you all, but you need to be reasonably compensated for it. I mean, stand up for yourself, and trust in yourself and your abilities to be able to do the job, because you're worth it. Your students are worth it. It's worth it for society. So I'm just so honored to be able to be a part of it for you all. And I'll end with kind of, again, my main message, if I could leave folks with anything, is just finding a way of getting folks engaged and involved, particularly folks at a younger age. You build that in for them at a younger age, give them that space, that platform to be able to share their voice. And that will be a lifelong lesson that they can take with them as they become an adult, and being able to speak out on their own and be confident and comfortable in speaking in public settings. So you can do that just as easily in the classroom by allowing folks to share their stories and encouraging them to show up to city council meetings or school board meetings or whatever that looks like. So anyways, I appreciate you all. I appreciate you, Rob, and I appreciate and love you both, Glenn and Aisha.
Awesome. So all the class members out there, I'd like you to type something in the chat. I'm not yet, and I'll say go in a second, but everybody type some sort of gratitude or thought that you want to share back with this panel. And I'll give you a minute to type it in, and then I'll say go, and everybody can hit enter, and we'll see all the thanks and gratitudes or thoughts you want to share with the panel members. I'll give you about 15 seconds to type something in there. And then I'm going to count to 3. 1, 2, 3, and hit enter. Great. So thanks, panel members. It's another exciting time. Boy, you all hit some new areas we hadn't hit before, so that was exciting.